Imagine standing on the edge of a world where the rules you trust, laws, authority, even the limits of the human body no longer apply. Picture a fog-soaked morning in March 1856. Northeastern Alabama, the air hangs thick, muffling sound, muting life, and yet something unnatural waits to emerge from the shadows. Plantation records, buried and nearly forgotten, hint at an event that should have been impossible. 12 men, trained, armed, and authorized by law, failed to restrain a single human being. Not through lack of effort, not through hesitation, but because the man they confronted had surrendered something far greater than mere defiance. He had surrendered the very control they believed they wielded over him. The plantation Harrington estate stretched over 3,000 acres. Meticulously organized, a microcosm of Southern order and authority. Overseers walked its paths like generals overseeing an army of the enslaved, maintaining control through precise schedules, punishment, and fear. And then came Jacob Terrell. Purchased at a Richmond auction years earlier for a sum that made even the wealthiest pause $2,000. Not for rebellion, not for inefficiency, but for strength. Industrial labor had shaped his body, compacted muscle upon muscle, forged in furnaces and ironworks far from Alabama's cotton fields. He arrived compliant, obedient, unremarkable to all but those who would notice strength like his. For 4 years, Jacob labored silently, almost invisibly, until the winter of 1855, a letter arrived, defying every law and expectation. Its contents never confirmed, yet witnesses described a transformation in him, a stillness, a precision, a quiet counting down of days and acts as if he were already living in a world beyond theirs. Those who observed him noticed the change, but no one could interpret it. Not the overseers, not the plantation owner, not the other enslaved workers who began to either seek his presence or avoid him entirely. Something in Jacob had shifted. A cognitive severance from the systems of control that surrounded him. March 14, 1856. The fog lay low on the land, the plantation waking in the usual rhythm. 12 men would converge on him, equipped with whips, bats, pistols, and authority. But what awaited them was beyond strategy, beyond muscle, beyond comprehension. The event that would unfold wasn't merely a fight, was a demonstration of the fragile nature of power itself. And it began with the simple refusal to obey. The morning air clung to the skin like a warning, each breath heavy with mist and expectation. Jacob stood at the cotton press, a silhouette against the gray fog. Calm, silent, immovable. Thomas Gibbard, head overseer, approached with the leather strap in hand, the ritual of punishment ready. He had disciplined countless workers in his lifetime, men who flinched, resisted, begged, or collapsed, but none like this. When he struck, Jacob did not react, not a flinch, not a gasp, not a twitch. Just an unwavering gaze, fixed somewhere beyond perception, somewhere the overseer could not follow. Eli Strauss and William Pritchard joined, each believing that sheer numbers, experience, brutality could bend this man. They moved to grab him, to force compliance, to remind him of the law, of ownership, of the consequences of resistance. Yet, as their hands met his body, the impossible revealed itself. Jacob's frame was not just strong, he had become unyielding. Arms like iron, legs like anchored roots, and a balance that refused physics itself. Witnesses described it as men attempting to topple a tree that had decided it would not fall. The other enslaved workers had stopped their labor, frozen mid-step, as if instinctively sensing the rupture in reality. Some whispered prayers. Others stared, knowing they were witnessing something beyond comprehension. The overseer's shouts and threats only ricocheted off Jacob's calm, a mind in control where fear no longer resided. More men were called, until 12 in total surrounded him, their authority concentrated in one impossible convergence. They attacked in unison, coordinating strikes, grips, and leverage. Every strategy that had worked countless times before failed utterly. And then came the moment the story turns from legend to something profoundly unsettling. The sounds, grunts, thuds, cries, did not come from Jacob. They came from the men themselves. Collisions with each other, their own force rebounding, their bodies bruised and broken against the immovable presence of a single human. He did not fight, did not strike, did not resist. And in his existence, he revealed the terrifying truth. Control is only an illusion, a system that can collapse if the mind refuses its dictates. Colonel Harrington arrived, fury etched into every line of his face, and witnessed the aftermath. For overseers lay injured, one unconscious, others bloodied and shaken. And at the center of this chaos stood Jacob Terrell, breathing, unbowed. It's untouchable, not because he was superhuman, but because he had severed himself from the fear, from the system, from the compliance that gave authority its power. For a moment, the colonel understood the scale of what had occurred. Not rebellion, not defiance, a revelation. A man who no longer plays by imposed rules cannot be controlled, cannot be coerced, cannot be contained. The plantation itself seemed to exhale, the fog now lifting to reveal a landscape forever changed. This was not a story of brute force, it was a story of awakening. The awakening had just begun. To understand the event that stunned 12 men and shook the foundations of Harrington Plantation, you must first understand Jacob Terrell, not as a body, but as a mind honed by years of unseen labor, danger, and endurance. Born in the iron furnaces, of Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, Jacob's adolescence was forged in heat, smoke, and relentless labor. By age 12, his hands knew the weight of molten iron, the precision required to shape raw metal into tools, weapons, and machinery. Muscles built in that inferno were not merely for strength. They were the product of discipline, necessity, and a kind of resilience no overseer in Alabama could anticipate. Jacob was sold to Colonel Harrington in 1852, a transaction that, on paper, seemed purely economic. But the documents, cold and factual, could never capture what lay beneath. They never spoke of the intelligence that scanned systems, measured leverage, and analyzed patterns of control. They never recorded the observation skills he had cultivated in furnaces, noting how force, timing, and repetition dictated outcomes. Jacob had spent his life in environments where errors meant injury, where submission was not an option, and where the mind had to become as unbreakable as the body. Upon arrival at Harrington, he was assigned the heaviest tasks, the projects requiring the most physical coordination. Yet for 4 years, he gave nothing more than compliant labor. He spoke little, drew no attention, and performed without incident. Observers saw obedience. Jacob, however, was calculating. He was observing the mechanisms of control, how punishments were applied, how fear was instilled, how authority was maintained. And in the quiet of those long Alabama nights, he processed the essential truth. Power exists only where it is believed in. Strip belief, and the system begins to unravel. The autumn of 1855 brought a turning point. A letter, its contents, lost to history, were potent enough to catalyze a psychological rupture. Witnesses described Jacob as standing motionless for hours, face pale, eyes distant, as if the world he had known had shifted on its axis. From that moment, something fundamental changed. Compliance no longer served survival, it had become optional. Authority had lost its ultimate leverage, the control over his mind. In the months leading to March 14th, subtle signs appeared. Jacob's questions about boundaries, rivers, and distances were not idle curiosity, they were reconnaissance, preparation. The quiet measurement of possibility. By the morning of confrontation, Jacob was not merely a man. He had become a vessel of inevitability. The physical impossibility of resisting 12 men was not only strength, it was the psychological mastery of detachment. He had withdrawn from their system, stepped outside their rules, and existed where their violence could not reach. Each overseer, no matter how trained or brutal, confronted not a man to dominate, but a presence immune to domination. And in that silent defiance, The first real fracture in Harrington's carefully constructed world appeared a subtle, terrifying reminder that control is always conditional, and one mind can dissolve the illusion entirely. March 14, 1856. The fog clung to the lowlands like a shroud, hiding the plantation's precise geometry in gray uncertainty. The cotton press area was silent, save for the crunch of boots on frost-hardened soil. Jacob Terrell stood alone, unarmed, waiting not in fear, not in anger, but in complete awareness. His body was a coiled engine, every muscle prepared, every nerve attuned. He knew what was coming, and so did those approaching him. Thomas Gibbard, the head overseer, led the first strike. Leather strap in hand, he approached with authority carved from years of unchallenged domination. He expected flinches, resistance, perhaps a struggle, but nothing that resembled this. Jacob did not move. His gaze, fixed beyond the men, was impenetrable. The first strike fell, leather connecting with shoulders that should have yielded under. Force, but they did not. Gibbard struck again, then again. Still no reaction. The other overseers glanced at one another in disbelief. This was no ordinary resistance. This was a defiance of natural law itself. Eli Strauss grabbed Jacob's arm. William Pritchard approached from the opposite side. They pushed, they twisted, they leveraged their combined strength. Jacob remained stationary, rooted like an ancient oak in the soil. Observers later described the scene as surreal, watching trained men collide against an immovable human wall. The struggle was not violent from Jacob's side. He made no aggressive move. Yet every ounce of force applied by the overseers rebounded, misdirected, leaving them bruised, exhausted, and increasingly desperate. One by one, more men were summoned. By the time 12 overseers had assembled, the scale of impossibility became undeniable. Men who had mastered violence, who had broken countless bodies through fear and whip, now collided with one man whose mind had already abandoned the rules they depended on. The fog lifted slowly, revealing the tableau of chaos. 12 armed men, coordinated, experienced, yet entirely incapable of achieving their objective. Each attempt to restrain Jacob ended. With failure, bodies slamming into the ground, arms twisted unnaturally, legs buckling under their own exertion. Colonel Harrington arrived at the scene, face darkened by fury and confusion. 4 overseers were injured, one unconscious, others staggering back, bruised and bloodied. The realization hit him immediately. This was not disobedience that could be punished. This was a fracture in the system itself. A single human being had exposed the vulnerability of every assumption about control, authority, and compliance. The plantation, the carefully orchestrated hierarchy, culture of fear, it all trembled under the silent power of one man who had decided that he belonged only to himself. Jacob stood at the center, breathing evenly, unbowed, untouched by the chaos surrounding him. The fog, the morning, the plantation's order, it all seemed secondary, irrelevant. In that moment, he was not just resisting, he was teaching. He was showing that physical dominance is meaningless against a mind that has renounced submission. And in the eyes of those who watched, the terrifying truth became clear. Control is never absolute. It exists only where belief persists, and Jacob had withdrawn his belief entirely. The fog had fully lifted now, revealing the scale of what had just occurred. The clearing was littered with the bodies of 12 men who had come to enforce control, yet found themselves utterly incapable of asserting it. Bruises, dislocated joints, and unconscious forms testified not to Jacob's aggression, but to the futility of conventional force against a mind and body that had severed compliance. Whispers of disbelief and fear spread among the enslaved workers, their eyes wide, their hands trembling. They had seen the impossible unfold before them, an event that challenged every lesson they had been taught about power, authority, and survival. Colonel Harrington arrived, his presence commanding, but even his authority felt diminished under the weight of the moment. He surveyed the scene, his mind racing. For overseers were incapacitated, the others wounded, and Jacob stood untouched, serene, a figure of absolute detachment. The realization settled in slowly, like a stone dropping in still water. This was not an ordinary act of resistance. This was a demonstration of something far more terrifying in understanding that the very systems of control upon which the plantation depended were fragile. They existed only as long as the minds they sought to dominate allowed them to exist. The overseers, men accustomed to obedience enforced through fear, now grappled with a deeper terror. What they had witnessed was not merely strength, it was the culmination of psychological liberation. Jacob's body had been honed by years of labor, but his mind had been sharpened by loss, observation, and the deliberate choice to disengage from the constraints imposed upon him. In his silence, in his immobility, he had shown that authority is only as real as belief in it. The implications rippled through everyone present. The enslaved community, who had witnessed the confrontation, carried a mix of awe and cautious fear. They had long understood the brutal mechanics of the plantation, the unyielding logic of punishment and reward. But Jacob's demonstration introduced a new variable, the possibility that one could exist outside of imposed systems. Murmurs passed between the cabins at night, cryptic and reverent. Stories of the morning's events spread, whispered by those who dared to speak, while others remained silent, feeling the dangerous weight of knowledge they were never meant to hold. Meanwhile, Colonel Harrington attempted to regain control, issuing strict orders for searches and confinement. Yet even his efforts were undermined by the realization that control is never absolute. Jacob's refusal had exposed a fundamental truth: obedience is voluntary, and the withdrawal of it can destabilize entire structures. That day, Harrington Plantation became more than a workplace. It became a theater of impossible knowledge. A lesson that no whip, no pistol, no calculated authority could undo. The question now lingered, haunting every mind on the estate. If one man could dismantle the power of 12, what did that mean for the rest? To understand the March morning in its full gravity, one must enter the mind of Jacob Terrell not as an observer, but as a man who had measured every detail, every potential outcome, and every consequence. His body alone had been remarkable, forged by years of industrial labor and physical rigor. But it was the mind behind that body, the calculated patience, the quiet detachment, that rendered 12 men powerless. Jacob had known long before that, mourning that physical dominance could only accomplish so much. True power, he realized, lay in psychological autonomy, the ability to refuse compliance completely. The letter he received months earlier had catalyzed a transformation that no overseer could detect until the moment it revealed itself in full. Its contents, a mixture of loss, hope, and warning, shifted Jacob's relationship to fear, authority, and survival. He understood that the system depended not solely on muscle or law, but on the internalized belief of those it sought to dominate. By severing his belief in their authority, by quietly withdrawing his participation in their imposed reality, he had effectively nullified their power before it was ever applied. That morning, as Gibbard approached with his leather strap, Jacob was fully aware of every movement. Every calculation of force, every expected response, had been anticipated. When the strap struck and nothing happened, it was not luck or defiance. It was applied knowledge, an understanding of human mechanics, leverage, and resistance. His previous years of labor had trained his body, but the months following the letter had trained his mind. Attachment became armor. Awareness became strategy. And in that foggy clearing, the physical impossibility of restraining him revealed the terrifying efficacy of a mind freed from imposed constraints. Witnesses would later describe the scene in fragmented whispers, struggling to make sense of what they had seen. Men collided with each other, falling, groaning, injured, while Jacob remained upright, unyielding, almost serene. His calmness was not ignorance or passivity, it was an intentional, conscious demonstration of control that he had taken entirely into his own hands. He did not need to fight. He did not need to dominate. He merely needed to exist, fully present in the realization that their authority had no hold over him. And this is the true terror of that day. The lesson buried beneath layers of injury and confusion. Power is only as real as those who accept it. Systems, hierarchies, threats, and punishments rely entirely on internalized obedience. Remove that obedience and the illusion collapses. Jacob's presence in the clearing, untouched, unbent, unbroken, proved that one man, when fully aware and fully autonomous, could render an entire apparatus of control impotent. This is not just history, it is a demonstration of human capability, a reminder of the terrifying potential that resides in the mind when it is liberated from fear. By mid-morning, the scene at Harrington Plantation had become surreal, almost grotesque in its impossibility. 12 trained, armed overseers, men who had broken bodies without hesitation. Men who had never faced failure were now stumbling over one another, bruised and bloodied, struggling to achieve what should have been effortless. Witnesses described collisions, falls, twisted limbs, and groans of pain that did not originate from Jacob, but from the very men attempting to subdue him. Each attempt to apply leverage, each coordinated push or pull, only magnified their own suffering. The law, the whip, the authority, none of it mattered. Gibbard, Eli Strauss, and William Pritchard, the three leading overseers, were the first to confront the depth of impossibility. Gibbard's shoulder dislocated under his own force. Strauss's jaw fractured against the stubborn mass of Jacob's arm. Pritchard rendered unconscious from a misjudged strike that sent him crashing into the ground. Even as they reeled, the remaining overseers tried again, desperate to maintain the illusion of control. But 12 men, coordinating in unison, still could not bend one human to their will. It was as if the plantation itself had betrayed them, the very laws of leverage and mechanics suspended, rearranged. By the presence of a mind that had already abandoned their world, the enslaved workers, scattered along the periphery, watched. In stunned silence, some whispered prayers. Some trembled, not only from fear, but from awe. They had long understood that survival required obedience, that resistance meant punishment. But what they were seeing now dismantled everything they had been taught. A single man refusing to comply had overturned the natural order. And in that act, the impossible became real. Colonel Harrington arrived, anger and disbelief etched on his face. He had witnessed authority fail in ways he had never imagined. For overseers lay incapacitated, the rest staggered, exhausted, and humiliated. And at the center of this chaos stood Jacob, breathing evenly, untouchable, his calm a mirror reflecting the absurdity of imposed power. He had not struck, not resisted actively, not made a move. His victory was total, not because of violence, but because of the complete withdrawal of consent to be dominated. This was a moment that would haunt Harrington Plantation for decades. Men who had been confident in the invincibility of the system now understood its fragility. The lesson was clear, terrifying, and unforgettable. Obedience is voluntary. Authority is conditional, and one determined mind can dismantle the mightiest apparatus if it refuses to participate. Jacob Terrell had not simply escaped. It demonstrated the ultimate truth about power. It exists only where it is believed. And in the bright morning light, surrounded by fog and broken men, that truth burned into the minds of every witness. The confrontation had ended, but the tension in the clearing remained thick, almost tangible, like smoke that refuses to dissipate. Jacob Terrell stood at the center, his chest rising and falling with measured calm, while 12 men, once confident in their authority, nursed broken bones and bruised egos. The plantation, for the first time, felt precarious. The illusion of control had been shattered, and the witnesses, both enslaved and free, understood that a new, darker order had been revealed. One mind had eclipsed the power of 12 trained men. And then, with deliberate, unhurried precision, Jacob moved. Not in panic, not in haste, but as if the world itself had agreed to part for him. Each step calculated, each motion measured. He walked toward the tree line bordering the northeastern boundary of Harrington Plantation. The overseers, still grappling with their own injuries and humiliation, shouted, aimed, gestured, but their authority had already slipped away. Jacob did not flee, simply existed outside the system, and in doing so, he was untouchable. Witnesses later recalled the surreal nature of his departure. The fog, once oppressive, now lifted like a curtain revealing a world that had become unfamiliar. Birds stirred in the trees. The distant river reflected light that seemed brighter than the men had ever seen, and the air vibrated with a tension that no one could name. And then he was gone, disappeared into the woods, leaving nothing behind but a space emptied of expectation, of control, of certainty. The 12 overseers, still reeling from their own failures, could only stare. A collective understanding dawning. What they had witnessed was not brute force or rebellion, but the emergence of a human mind unbound, liberated from the constraints they thought were absolute. The psychological aftermath rippled immediately. Fear, awe, and confusion intertwined in the observers' minds. For the enslaved, Jacob became a figure of possibility, a demonstration that even in the most controlled systems, freedom could exist if one possessed the courage to detach completely from imposed authority. For the overseers, humiliation and disbelief festered, eroding confidence, shaking belief in the permanence of their power. And for Colonel Harrington, the realization that a single man had rendered 12 armed men powerless became a private nightmare he could not escape. Jacob's exit was not just physical, it was symbolic. He had demonstrated that true strength lies not in resistance, but in refusal, not in confrontation, but in detachment. And as he vanished into the woods, he carried with him a dangerous truth. Control is always contingent, authority always conditional, and a liberated mind can render an entire system obsolete. The Harrington Plantation would never look the same again, because the invisible chains that bound human will had been exposed, and one man had shown how easily they could be broken. Jacob Terrell had vanished into the dense woods, but the impact of his presence lingered like a dark shadow over Harrington Plantation. The 12 overseers, battered and humiliated, regrouped with careful, trembling movements. The plantation, once a machine of strict order and precise control, had become a landscape of uncertainty. Colonel Harrington, furious and disbelieving, immediately ordered a full lockdown. No one was permitted to leave their designated areas. Every movement was monitored, every face scrutinized. Yet even these measures could not erase the unsettling truth they had witnessed something beyond their understanding, something that could not be corrected with punishment, force, or intimidation. Riders were dispatched to neighboring plantations. Dogs were released to track, and 23 men, including local law enforcement and hired trackers, scoured the nearby woods. They searched every creek, every hollow, every abandoned structure within a 20-mile radius. Yet the forest swallowed Jacob as if he had never existed. Dogs picked up his trail for a short distance, then lost it at a creek, unable to follow. Further, every measure of pursuit, every tactic honed over years of tracking enslaved people or criminals, failed utterly. Jacob had demonstrated that physical tracking is irrelevant when a man's mind is fully in control, fully present, and fully determined. Meanwhile, the plantation's enslaved community, witnesses to the morning's impossible event, remained silent when questioned. Their discretion was a shield, their quiet defiance a subtle rebellion. Yet among themselves, stories circulated like whispers of a forbidden truth. Jacob's departure was no longer just an escape. It had become a psychological event. His calm detachment, his mastery over the overseers, and his sudden disappearance shattered the perceived invincibility of authority. Those who had once feared punishment now contemplated the terrifying possibility that one could exist beyond control entirely. Colonel Harrington, attempting to maintain the illusion of command, doubled down on structure and surveillance. Yet privately, he wrestled with the implications. The system he had built, meticulous, precise, and brutally efficient, had been exposed as fragile. His own hands, steady for decades, trembled at the knowledge that one man, simply by withdrawing compliance, rendered all his power meaningless. The plantation would continue to function outwardly, but inside, a fissure had formed, an unspoken terror threading through every overseer, every worker, every corner of Harrington. In that moment, it became clear Jacob Terrell had not merely escaped. He had rewritten the rules of engagement, redefined the limits of control, and demonstrated a terrifying principle that would haunt everyone who had witnessed it. Authority is a shared illusion, obedience a choice. And when one mind refuses to participate, even the mightiest system collapses under the weight of impossibility. The search continued for 11 days, but the truth had already settled into the collective consciousness. Harrington Plantation would never be the same again. The aftermath of March 14th rippled far beyond the physical injuries inflicted on the overseers. Thomas Gibbard, Eli Strauss, and William Pritchard, once confident arbiters of discipline, were now haunted by the impossible memory of Jacob Terrell. Gibbard dislocated his shoulder during the confrontation. Strauss's jaw remained fractured for weeks. Pritchard, who had been knocked unconscious, began drinking heavily, attempting to drown the terror lodged deep in his mind. Within days, Gibbard submitted his resignation, citing a moral impossibility he could no longer ignore. Strauss followed 2 days later, offering only that he could not explain what had happened and that he would return to Kentucky. Pritchard lingered longer, but the marks of that morning followed him relentlessly, shaping every thought, every movement, every uneasy glance into the woods. Colonel Harrington, for all his wealth, power, and meticulous planning, found himself facing a private nightmare. The system he had built with such precision, the plantation, the authority, the meticulously structured hierarchy, had been exposed as fragile. Jacob's refusal to be coerced, his serene withdrawal from authority, demonstrated a terrifying principle. Compliance is optional, and authority only exists as long as it is acknowledged. Harrington struggled to reconcile his understanding of control with the simple truth that one man, fully resolved, had dismantled the machinery he depended on. He could suppress the incident publicly, limit discussion, and even threaten consequences, but the knowledge had already spread. Among the enslaved community, the event became legend almost immediately. Whispered accounts described the morning in vivid, reverent detail. Jacob was no longer just a man. He became a symbol, a living proof that the seemingly absolute could be undone. Some expressed hope, imagining freedom within reach, inspired by the knowledge that one human being could exist beyond the reach of power. Others harbored fear, aware of the potential repercussions if authorities discovered how fully compliance had been withdrawn. Yet the seed had been planted, and it was impossible to erase. Subtle, dangerous changes began to manifest in the daily rhythms of the plantation. Tasks continued, yes, but efficiency now contained a quiet, deliberate resistance, workers completing their duties with minimal effort, avoiding overt disobedience but refusing to surrender entirely. Authority became a fragile, brittle thing. Every glance at the woods where Jacob had disappeared carried a silent question. What if we too chose not to comply? What if the system depended on our belief and we withdrew it? For Colonel Harrington and his overseers, the psychological toll was immense. Their confidence, once absolute, was replaced with tension, uncertainty, and the constant awareness that control could no longer be. Assumed it had to be constantly defended against minds willing to refuse it. Jacob Terrell had not only escaped, he had rewritten the rules of engagement, exposing a truth that would haunt every interaction, every act of authority, and every silent thought among those bound within the plantation. He had demonstrated that true power lies not in domination, but in the refusal to be dominated. And in doing so, he had set in motion a subtle, unstoppable ripple one mind had defied 12. And the world of Harrington Plantation would never be the same. Jacob Terrell's actions were not the result of sudden impulse. They were the culmination of months of careful observation, deliberate preparation, and psychological mastery. The letter he received in the autumn of 1855 delivered against the rules. Hidden from the overseers was more than a personal message. It was a catalyst. The words it contained, filled with sorrow, love, and an urgent warning, which shifted his perception of authority, compliance, and survival. From that moment, Jacob's mind began to operate with a precision no overseer could anticipate. He was no longer simply a body to be directed, became a strategist, a man whose autonomy rendered brute force meaningless. The intercepted letter, which Colonel Harrington's own men had mishandled, became a secret instrument of liberation. Jacob understood the psychological mechanics of control, that authority relies not only on physical domination, but on the internalized acceptance of rules. By quietly processing the letter, understanding its implications, and mentally detaching from the plantation's imposed reality, he created a state where resistance was unnecessary. He simply refused to participate. Every overseer, every law, every whip became irrelevant the moment he severed his psychological tether to their system. In the weeks leading up to March 14th, Jacob's behavior shifted subtly. He asked questions about property lines, river depths, and neighboring counties not from curiosity alone, but to map potential exits and understand the landscape through which he would move. He engaged minimally with the work, performing tasks with mechanical precision, while mentally rehearsing the moments when the system would confront him. Every glance, every measured silence was part of a larger strategy, a demonstration not of brute strength, but of controlled inevitability. Martha Clemens, the head cook, later recalled that Jacob often appeared distant during these months, as if he were already somewhere else. His presence on the plantation was a mask, a performance that concealed a mind engaged in constant calculation. He studied the patterns of the overseers, the timing of the bell, the distribution of men across the fields. He observed the weaknesses in their coordination, noting how authority fractured under stress and how fear amplified errors. By the time the confrontation occurred, Jacob had rehearsed every outcome, every response, every human limitation he might encounter. This was the essence of his power, the ability to render 12 trained men impotent without striking a blow, without aggressive resistance, without confrontation in any conventional sense. He had become untouchable, not through violence, but through the mastery of thought, observation, and the deliberate detachment from imposed reality. What the overseers witnessed that March morning was not merely physical impossibility. It was the result of a mind that had withdrawn consent entirely, a mind that had become free within the confines of captivity. Jacob Terrell had weaponized autonomy, and the world would never forget it. Jacob Terrell's disappearance was more than an escape. It was a statement. It's a deliberate act that communicated a truth far beyond his own freedom. Days after vanishing, a small bundle was discovered near the northeastern edge of the plantation, hidden in the hollow of an oak tree. Inside were 3 objects: a wooden carving of 2 figures holding hands, a scrap of paper with an address in Georgia, and a small metal tag from an iron foundry. Each item carried symbolic weight, speaking to identity, purpose, and the skill that had shaped his life. But it was the note accompanying the bundle that revealed the depth of Jacob's understanding, the philosophy underpinning his actions. "I ain't running. I'm walking slow and steady. I'm going to Georgia. Probably take me 4 months if I move careful. If I make it, you won't never hear of me again. If I don't make it, at least I died trying to get back to what matters." That morning at the press, I wasn't fighting nobody. I was just showing y'all that I ain't a thing you can move around no more. I'm a man deciding where he goes. These words, simple yet profound, reframed the March 14th confrontation. The violence had not come from Jacob, yet it was unmistakable. The overseers' injuries were the natural consequence of their own force applied against an unyielding mind. Jacob had weaponized autonomy, turning their aggression into a demonstration of his invincibility. The note also carried an unsettling moral clarity. Jacob addressed Colonel Harrington directly, acknowledging the man's authority while pointing out its inherent fragility. He recognized the systems built on lies, the control maintained through fear, yet he approached them without hatred. Instead, He highlighted the psychological weight borne by those in power, the subtle curse of knowing wrongdoing while perpetuating it. The note revealed a mind that had not only survived oppression, but had mastered the art of influence, reshaping perception. Without a single act of overt aggression, among the enslaved community, the bundle became a symbol of hope, inspiration, and quiet rebellion. Jacob's words offered a framework for understanding power differently. It is fragile, conditional, and entirely dependent on consent. For the overseers, it became a source of fear and reflection. Even those who had survived the confrontation could not ignore the truth it carried. Authority, they realized, could collapse silently, without warning, if one individual refused to participate. Jacob Terrell had done more than escape. He had rewritten the rules of human capability. His actions, his words, and the deliberate symbolism of the note exposed the core truth about power. It is not maintained through force alone, but through the compliance of minds. And when those minds are liberated, when consent is withdrawn, the strongest structures can crumble, leaving only the echoes of a single, unbreakable human will. Months passed after Jacob Terrell's disappearance. But the tremors of March 14th never faded from Harrington Plantation. The overseers, once confident in their authority, now moved with a quiet unease, always aware that control was a fragile illusion. Even the most disciplined, most experienced men questioned the solidity of the hierarchy they had upheld for years. Thomas Gibbard and Eli Strauss had already resigned, leaving gaps in leadership that could not be filled by force alone. William Pritchard lingered, but his increasing dependency on alcohol betrayed a mind haunted by the impossible memory of that morning. The psychological scars were far deeper than any physical injuries, and they lingered in every glance toward the tree line, toward the woods that had swallowed Jacob without a trace. For the enslaved workers, the event transformed everyday reality. They had witnessed the demonstration of autonomy, and it reshaped their understanding of submission. Tasks were completed, yes, but with a subtle, deliberate efficiency that maintained outward compliance while quietly testing boundaries. The act of refusing to participate in the system's narrative without overt rebellion became a form of power. Jacob had shown that resistance was not merely physical. It was mental, deliberate, and unstoppable when wielded correctly. His examples spread in whispers and glances, and stories passed quietly from one person to another, shaping the collective consciousness in ways that plantation owners could neither anticipate nor fully control. Colonel Harrington, meanwhile, faced a private reckoning. Its meticulously organized plantation, which had functioned as a model of order and authority, filled cracks no whip or punishment could repair. He hired additional overseers to restore control, but the pattern repeated: the new men, unprepared for the psychological weight of Jacob's demonstration, resigned or faltered within months. Every effort to enforce the old paradigm encountered invisible resistance, a subtle but unyielding refusal to be coerced. The plantation's machinery continued to function, but the certainty of obedience, the very foundation of Harrington's confidence, was gone. Jacob Terrell's influence, though indirect, reshaped the power dynamic permanently. He had proven that authority is conditional, that force without consent is impotent, and that the human mind, once freed from imposed fear, can render systems ineffective without lifting a hand in anger. The legacy of March 14th was not merely the story of a single man who could not be restrained. It was a lasting lesson in the fragility of control, the potency of psychological autonomy, and the terrifying reality that one enlightened mind can silently destabilize the most rigid structures. Harrington Plantation would never again operate under the illusion of complete domination, and the shadow of Jacob Terrell's unbroken will would linger in every corner, in every whispered conversation, and in every heartbeat of those who remembered what they had witnessed. After disappearing into the dense woods of Harrington Plantation, Jacob Terrell embarked on a journey that tested not only his physical strength, but the depth of his patience, foresight, and strategic mind. He did not run blindly, driven by fear or desperation. He moved deliberately, calculating each step to minimize exposure and maximize survival. every creek crossing, every forest path. Every encounter with the unpredictable terrain of Alabama's bottomlands was anticipated, rehearsed mentally, and executed with precision. This was not the flight of a man trying to escape punishment, it was the methodical advance of a mind determined to remain untouchable. For 11 days, search parties scoured the land, tracking dogs following scent trails that vanished at critical points. As if Jacob had stepped outside the laws of pursuit themselves, he moved slowly, never hurried, ensuring that the patterns left behind misled those who chased him. Every decision reflected not only knowledge of the land, but an understanding of human psychology. He allowed searchers to predict one course while executing another, turning their assumptions into tools of concealment. It was the ultimate demonstration that control over oneself could outmatch control imposed by an entire system, even without food, caches, or outside assistance. Jacob relied on intimate knowledge of his environment, scavenging and navigating with a precision that made survival appear effortless. He avoided the roads, circumvented the plantations, and moved through the wilderness like a ghost, leaving only subtle traces that were insufficient for capture. Each day, his mind reinforced a principle he had learned from the latter months. Before, physical dominance is meaningless without mental mastery, and the world bends only when the mind refuses to bend itself. When the search parties finally abandoned their efforts, they had no idea that Jacob had already mapped a route spanning hundreds of miles, leading him toward Georgia, where his wife and unborn child awaited. Every step was a calculated risk, each movement designed to balance safety with progress. By the time he reached the edge of the plantation's territory, he was more than a man who had survived oppression. He was a symbol, a master of his own fate, a figure whose deliberate detachment from fear and compliance made him untouchable. Jacob Terrell's escape was not just physical, it was an exhibition of a deeper, terrifying truth. One disciplined, autonomous mind could outmaneuver the assumptions, resources, and authority of an entire system. Every step, every choice, every silent calculation reinforced the same lesson. Freedom begins in the mind, and once that is secured, no man, no law, no institution can truly bind you. Months of calculated movement through hostile territory brought Jacob Terrell to the edge of Georgia, where a life he had long imagined awaited. His wife, sold south after her owner's death, had carried their child through the treacherous months without knowing if Jacob survived. When they finally reunited, it was not a frantic embrace of relief, but a quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of shared survival and reclaimed autonomy. In that moment, Jacob's journey transcended the personal. It became a statement on the nature of resilience, determination, and the capacity of a single mind to dismantle the structures designed to suppress it. Shortly after, Jacob sent a letter to Colonel Harrington, carefully composed, precise in its language, and devastating in its clarity. It was not a note of vengeance, nor a declaration of triumph. Instead, it was a mirror held to the plantation's system, revealing its fragility, its dependence on compliance, and the psychological power wielded by those who chose to withdraw from it. "I ain't your property no more," he wrote. "Every single person you own is making the same choice I made every single day. You don't own nobody, Colonel. You just got a system that makes it hard for people to choose different. But hard ain't the same as impossible. I proved that." The words cut deeper than any whip or punishment, exposing the lie beneath Harrington's carefully maintained authority. The impact of Jacob's journey extended beyond the plantation. Overseers who had survived the confrontation never regained confidence. The enslaved community, inspired by whispers of his escape and the deliberate philosophy he demonstrated, began to internalize a new understanding of power. True mastery lies in the mind, the refusal to participate in systems that demand obedience. Compliance became a choice, resistance, a quiet strategy, and autonomy, a weapon more formidable than physical force. Jacob's journey reframed the rules entirely. demonstrating that the greatest strength does not reside in the body, but in the mind unshackled by fear. Even Colonel Harrington, whose wealth and power had seemed absolute, faced a private reckoning. The letter, coupled with the impossibility of Jacob's journey, forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that his entire system of control was built on conditional authority, susceptible to collapse whenever an individual refused to comply. The realization was subtle, terrifying, and permanent. One enlightened mind could destabilize the very foundation of his world. Jacob Terrell had not merely survived. He had redefined what survival meant. He had transformed himself into a symbol of psychological liberation, a living testament that autonomy, foresight, and deliberate detachment could overcome any system designed to contain it. The Harrington plantation would forever bear the shadow of his impossible journey, a reminder that power, no matter how absolute it seems, is ultimately fragile in the face of an unbreakable mind. Jacob Terrell's story does not end in the woods of Alabama or the fields of Georgia. It lives in every mind that dares to question authority, that refuses to surrender compliance to a system designed to control. The lesson he left behind is simple, yet devastating. Power is an illusion maintained by the consent of the controlled. One man, by mastering his own mind, can unravel centuries of imposed order, demonstrating that freedom begins within. Every step Jacob took, every breath he measured, every choice to act or not act was a demonstration of a principle that remains as relevant today as it was in 1856. True. Strength lies not in force, but in unwavering mental sovereignty. Consider what it means for us now. How many structures, systems, and hierarchies dictate our choices without us even realizing? Jacob Terrell shows us that the first act of liberation is internal. By deciding what you will or will not accept, by understanding that compliance is a choice, you reclaim control over your own life. The 12 overseers, the plantation, the laws, even death itself could not bind a mind fully committed to autonomy. This is not myth or legend, it is recorded history. It's verified in witness testimonies and documents, long buried, still powerful enough to shake the foundations of assumed power. Now, I want you to participate in a small ritual with me. Comment below the phrase, "I choose my path" twice. Write it, repeat it. Let this action cement the understanding that your mind is yours alone, that no external force can command what you refuse to surrender. By doing this, you engage not just with the story of Jacob Terrell, but with the principle he embodied. One human mind, fully aware and fully autonomous, is stronger than any system of control. If this story resonated with you, if it awakened even a fragment of the realization that authority is conditional and strength begins in the mind, then do not forget to like this video. Share it with those who need to hear it and subscribe to Fear Liturgy for more dark history that challenges the very foundation of what you believe to be possible. Remember, these truths are dangerous, but they are necessary. They illuminate the structures that bind us, and they offer a path to mastering not only the world around us, but the unbreakable power that exists within ourselves. Jacob Terrell's legacy is simple. He chose his mind over imposed control. He chose his path over fear, and in doing so, he became untouchable. You can choose the same. Start by acknowledging the truth, engaging with it, and letting it reshape the way you see power. His story is over, but the lesson is eternal, and it begins here with you.